Hello everybody, and welcome to today's webinar entitled How to Quickly Prioritize High-Risk Offenders Using the Level of Service Inventory Revised Screening Version, brought to you by Multi Health Systems Inc., or MHS. My name is James Land. I'm a research scientist at MHS. For the last 11 years, I've been working in forensic psychology research and test development. I played a vital role in the development and publication of various psychological assessments such as the Hare Self-Report Psychopathy Scale 4th edition and the Comprehensive Executive Function Inventory for adults. My colleague, Caroline Gauvin, is a public safety assessment consultant. She's been working at MHS for the past 5 years, working with many individuals who I'm sure are in the audience today on how to successfully implement psychological assessments and risk need assessments within their correctional facility. I'd like to start by saying a quick thank you to the Level of Service Inventory authors, Dr. James L. Bonta and the late Dr. Don Andrews. If you haven't had a chance to check out Dr. Bonta's webinar on theory, risk need responsivity, and LS instruments, I highly suggest you do. We'll put a link below this video. It provides very valuable and comprehensive information about the theoretical framework in which risk assessment in general and the level of service inventory tools were developed. A little bit about MHS. Multi Health Systems is a global publisher of scientifically validated assessments in the clinical, education, talent assessment, and public safety markets. We are located in Toronto, Canada, and have been in business for over 30 years. We publish assessments in over 50 languages and have a presence in 75 countries around the world, so we are truly global. Our outline for today's presentation: I'm going to start by providing you a brief introduction on the level of service inventory assessments, and in particular, the LSI-R SV. I'm then going to hand it over to Caroline, who's going to talk about the cost of criminal justice industry and increasing caseloads. I will then be giving you a more in-depth analysis of the LSI-R SV, benefits of the LSI-R SV, research in the development and independent research on the tool, as well as talking about the LSI-R SV in practice. So let's talk about the level of service assessments, which is where the LSI-R SV lives. LSI-R SV is part of a larger family of tools, which are the level of service assessments. In this family, there are tools for juvenile offenders, the YLS-CMI, and for adult offenders, the LS-CMI, the LSI-R, the LS-RNR, and the LSI-R SV. These tools are designed to measure risk of recidivism and factors related to supervision and programming. They're used by probation officers, psychologists, and correctional workers to inform resource allocation, offender placement, case planning, security classification, and treatment progress, to name a few. Research has shown that using a validated risk need assessment can reduce recidivism. What is important here is that the tool has been validated, not just by the developer or the publisher or the authors of the tool, but by independent researchers in a variety of offender populations and settings. The LS assessments are some of the most well-researched risk tools in the world. I'd like to share some of these research findings with you. There's been over 200 peer-reviewed journal articles on the LS tools, and I'd like to share a couple of them with you. If you want more information about additional research that is out there, feel free to reach out to me, and I will be able to provide you with some more information. But let's look at a couple of findings. Ulver and colleagues in 2013 found that the LS tool scores significantly predicted sexual and violent recidivism. Schmidt and Sinclair and Thomasdotter in 2016 revealed that the YLS-CMI predicted nonviolent, violent, sexual, and technical recidivism. Ferguson and colleagues found the LS assessment scores were strongly correlated with nonviolent and violent recidivism among a sample of mentally ill offenders. You can see that the level of service assessments have been well researched, and that is extremely important because you know that it's working in a variety of settings for a variety of offenders. And that's exactly where the LSI-R SV lives. And we'll be talking a little bit more about research on the LSI-R SV a little bit later on in this presentation. But first, let's take a quick look at the LSI-R SV. It's an 8-item screener of risk needs. It has 85% fewer items than its parent tool, the LSI-R, which has 54 items, and it was developed using a highly representative normative sample. The LSI-RSV is part of a 2-tiered triage process. The LSI-RSV lives at Tier 1. The SV scores will tell you if an offender is minimum, medium, or maximum risk of reoffending. Research shows that offenders who are medium and maximum risk, or medium and high risk, are in greatest need of immediate treatment that is more intensive than what you would give to a lower risk offender. Medium and maximum risk offenders will move on to Tier 2 of the triage process, where they will receive a full risk need assessment, like the LSI-R or the LSCMI, that provide crucial information that help develop an effective offender treatment plan. I'd now like to pass it over to Caroline, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the criminal justice system.
So I think we can all agree in the criminal justice industry that our institutions aren't really keeping up with the number of adult offenders entering the system. There are over 2.2 million people that make up the prison and jail populations in the U.S. That represents a whopping 500% increase over the past 40 years. That translates to nearly 1 out of every 200 Americans are behind bars. Compounding this further is the national recidivism rate, which also remains stubbornly high. Among incarcerated women, 30% of them will at some point in time return to prison after being released. And at least 50% of men will return to prison within 3 years. This growing trend is having a revolving door effect, resulting in our institutions always running at capacity, or more commonly these days, overcapacity. The fiscal burden is increasing on jurisdictions to continually accommodate the expanding system. And so these populations continue to grow and will continue to incur billions of dollars in costs. Costs like capital costs to build new infrastructure and the ongoing operational costs to run them. And let's not forget the staffing resources needed. The Bureau of Justice Statistics reported in 2014 that 28 states are holding more prisoners than their estimated capacity. In one particular state, that will remain nameless, there are roughly 26,000 prisoners, which is nearly double the amount of inmates the system was designed to hold. And in at least 3 other states, they were also found to be operating at 150% capacity. So I think we can all agree that there is a significant infrastructure problem, and finding appropriate housing for all of these offenders is a challenge. I can actually recall for one of our clients, they were in such a pickle that they had no choice but to convert non-housing facilities to accommodate the growing influx. And it got so bad that they had to use a recreational games type room. And so unfortunately, all of the demands and pressures on our system have just not been appropriately matched with funding. So as our budgets continue to be tight, it becomes even more difficult to manage the increasing size of caseloads that are being assigned to our officers. Even if budgets are being cut, our number one goal should always be on protecting the public. In fiscal year 2014, $40 billion was spent to incarcerate and supervise offenders in state prisons. It costs roughly $28,000 to incarcerate one person in federal prison for 1 year. And in some state prisons, the costs are much higher. And when you look at the aging prison population, they require even more costly care, roughly $100,000 per year per prisoner. In the state of California, the average annual cost of healthcare for elderly prisoners was $42,000. And anecdotally, I can share with you, one officer I had spoken to in the past was sharing with me how she inherited a very large caseload from someone else, and it had well over 300 offenders, and that was now in her caseload. It wasn't until months and months later that she learned that, in fact, 7 of those people were deceased. Can you imagine? So departments are really being stretched way too thin, and it is an increasing challenge balancing the interest of the public while under such budgetary constraints. So to really have a significant impact on reducing recidivism, departments must target people who have a moderate to high probability of reoffending. The ability to sort offenders by risk, that is, to accurately separate those who are more likely to cause greater harm from those who are less likely to cause relatively little harm. And we know that risk assessments help to accurately predict not only how likely a person is to commit a new offense, but also whether that offense will be a violent one. The risk score produced can be compared with other offenders and used to guide decisions about what level of supervision is the best fit and which interventions will target the attitudes and behaviors that drive that specific offender's criminal activity. Research has shown that providing the most intensive supervision and treatment for people at a high risk of reoffending results in the greatest reductions in recidivism. It has also shown that requiring intensive programming for people at a low risk of reoffending is counterproductive and often increases their likelihood of reoffending. The Pew Center reported findings that the level of service tools accurately identify individuals at a high risk of recidivating. The chart here demonstrates that it is possible to predict the likelihood of recidivism using the level of service tools. So we face the fact that the average U.S. probation officer supervises 139 clients at any given time. As a result, these officers are forced to divide caseloads between high-risk clients and others who are then partially or even completely ignored. So offender supervision is a human capital intensive activity. There's really no technological or automated solution to this problem. While technological innovations have certainly transformed the work of the officer, they've primarily improved things like monitoring capabilities and access to information. But really little has been done to change the core correctional practices that comprise case management. With very high caseloads, it can be difficult to do a full risk needs assessment and on all offenders. High caseloads represent a major problem for officers. In one northeastern state, one probation officer may deal with up to 256 offenders. And when faced with such overwhelming numbers, officers have little choice but to focus on high-risk cases, which leaves most offenders with minimal or no supervision. Okay, so we recognize that caseloads are simply too big to manage without some sort of triaging. There's simply not enough hours in the day to properly provide services to all of these offenders. And throughout the criminal justice system, we see lower risk offenders are over-supervised and higher risk offenders are under-supervised. Developing innovative and cost-effective solutions to handle the 7 million plus adults in our system without jeopardizing public safety is of prime importance. And by using a triage approach, we can better manage these high caseloads. We know, that is, research has informed us, that implementing evidence-based practices has proven time and time again to be successful in reducing recidivism and positively affect change in people's lives. Evidence-based practice requires that offenders who are of higher risk be supervised and managed at higher levels, and offenders at lower risk are managed and supervised at lower levels. We also know from research that to supervise low-risk offenders too aggressively will increase their chance of reoffending. And likewise, to supervise high-risk offenders too little will increase their risk of reoffending. So the offenders that would benefit from intensive programming are those at highest risk. And economically speaking, we can get the most bang for our buck when we provide services to these high-risk offenders. By doing so, we are protecting the community by making sure those high-risk offenders who are at greatest risk of reoffending are receiving services that will reduce the likelihood they will do so in the future, and offering services to those individuals at greater need. It is very important we identify high-risk from low-risk offenders, as their needs are vastly different. And by not triaging, you could be doing more harm than good for the offender. Numerous studies have demonstrated the importance of risk assessment in developing effective correctional programming. Undoubtedly, there are major cost savings when we divert low-risk offenders from intensive and costly correctional programs. There is also the matter of improving public safety by identifying those offenders who pose the greatest risk of continuing their criminal behavior. One of the major benefits of offender assessment and classification is that it allows agencies to allocate resources and staff more optimally and effectively. However, this can make it difficult to complete a full risk needs assessment on all offenders in a designated amount of time. And we know that completing a risk assessment is a critical step towards establishing an effective rehabilitation plan for an offender. So the question becomes, how can we, the jurisdictions, reduce the time and resources required to conduct a risk assessment, but still identify which offenders may be moved to a minimum supervision and remain at a low risk of recidivating? To resolve this conflict, many jurisdictions have begun to adopt a screening assessment designed to get a first cut assessment of offenders simply for the purpose of moving as many low-risk offenders as possible to a minimum supervision caseload, and using the more comprehensive risk needs assessment on higher risk individuals. Given that a comprehensive risk needs assessment can be relatively labor-intensive, costly, and impractical for all offenders, screening is designed to be a reliable and efficient filter for triaging offenders right away. So why does this all matter? Well, not all offenders pose the same level of risk. And the limited resources we do have forces us to make difficult choices about how we spend our time. And by focusing on those that pose the highest level of risk, it's the best use of our officers' time. And vice versa, focusing on low-risk offenders can have counterproductive results. Screening tools such as the LSI-R SV ensures your resources are spent in a targeted and impactful way. And with that, I'd like to pass it back to James, who will provide a behind-the-scenes look at the LSI-R SV.
Thanks, Caroline. So what is the LSI-R SV? Let's take a closer look. 7 out of 8 items are drawn from the comprehensive LSI-R and LSCMI assessments. 6 items are dynamic in nature, and this is what truly sets the screening version apart from other screeners that are in the market, in that it's telling you what is putting the offender at risk of reoffending at the time of the assessment, and what areas should we focus on in treatment to try and reduce that risk. Item responses vary from yes or no to a 0 to 3 point scale. Total risk scores coincide with a risk need level of minimum, medium, or maximum. So why was it created? Caroline did a fantastic job of giving us a description of what the criminal justice system currently looks like, and the LSI-RSV is attempting to correct some of those issues that she highlighted. It's to deal with major increases in offender intake. There's a growing concern that augmented workloads will jeopardize good correctional practices, and that proper protocol requires every offender be assessed, processed, and classified. The challenge then becomes trying to do so in a way that is not only reliable and empirically defensible, but also effectively utilizes resources. I'd like to go over a quick case study to illustrate how the LSI-RSV can be used in a daily correctional setting. I want you to imagine you're a probation officer. It is Thursday morning. You've just received 50 new offenders in your caseload that you need to assess and classify. To administer a full risk need assessment like the LSCMI, it might take you upwards of 50 hours. You don't work on the weekends, so the offenders most in need of treatment at the bottom of your pile won't receive services until well into next week. Your first offender is John. He is a first-time offender with steady employment and a good education, and he has a supportive family. He drinks socially once a month, but it does not negatively impact any areas of his life. He does not do drugs, and he realizes that his crime was a mistake and says he will never do it again. You administer the LSI-RSV to John and see that he is a minimum risk offender or a low risk offender. Lucky for you, the next 34 offenders you assess using the LSI-RSV are all similar to John. They're all low risk offenders, making up about 70% of that population that you're in your caseload. The 36th offender is Robert. He is 33 and has been in and out of custody since he was 14 years old. He has a serious substance abuse problem. This, in combination with his lack of education, makes it very difficult for him to find and maintain employment. He claims he loves his criminal lifestyle. It excites him and he doesn't see anything wrong with it. You administer the LSI-RSV to Robert and you see that he is a maximum risk offender of reoffending. After seeing his high risk score, you administer the full LSCMI to Robert. You get him set up with an appropriate treatment plan, and you've done this all before lunch. You've saved time, but more importantly, you got help to Robert, who is in need. You got it done quickly and efficiently. I'm going to pass it back over to Caroline, who's going to give you a little bit more information about how beneficial a screener can be in your triaging process.
So clearly we've identified that it's critical that we free up time for our officers whenever we can. The traditional practice of conducting a comprehensive risk needs assessment can take an average of 45 minutes. For example, when using the LSCMI or LSI-R risk needs assessment. Whereas the LSI-R SV takes only 10 to 15 minutes of your time. So from a pure mathematical standpoint, the screening version can save us that much time up front and during the intake process. So let's take a closer look using an example of how the LSI-R SV can save time. So assuming we have a caseload size of 100,000 offenders, which represents the average state caseload, normally the administrative time to complete a full risk and needs assessment can take on average 45 minutes. So that would require a total of 75,000 hours of your officer's time. But if you were to take that same 100,000 offender caseload and administer the LSI-R SV, the administration time would greatly reduce to, again, 10 to 15 minutes on average, which amounts to a total of 25,000 total hours of your officer's time. And knowing that roughly 20% or 1 out of every 5 offenders will score medium to high risk based on the normative sample for inmate and probation populations, this translates to approximately 20,000 of those 100,000 offenders in your caseload. So these medium to high risk offenders will move on to receive the full assessment right away. This represents a total savings of 35,000 hours. Or you could look at it as a 47% time savings per offender. Now, wouldn't we all love to have those additional hours? So we can confidently say that the LSI-R SV gives us the ability to reduce time spent on assessing the 100,000 offenders. Again, this was just an example for illustrative purposes, and I'd be happy to rerun the calculations based on your caseload. And not only does the LSI-R SV have the potential to save us time, it also has the potential to save us money. Using the screening version, we can now better allocate the officer's time and determine the appropriate level of supervision based on likelihood to reoffend. If we look at the average salary of a U.S. correctional officer, they earn roughly $45,000 a year, or an hourly wage of $19. Now, if we take the total hours saved by using the triage approach in our previous example, so 35,000 hours, and multiply that by the hourly wage for an officer, so $19 an hour, that translates to a total potential savings of $665,000. And again, wouldn't we all love to have those cost savings? The LSI-R SV can also indirectly save taxpayer dollars through the better allocation of supervision. As we all know, incarceration can be very expensive, and reduce the number of health-related issues offenders experience when living in the conditions of overcrowded jails and prisons. Clearly, the LSI-R SV can help decision makers better allocate their scarce resources. I'm now going to pass it back to James, and he'll take a deep dive into the psychometric properties of the LSI-R SV.
Thanks, Caroline. Now let's take a look at the psychometric properties of the LSI-R SV. We're going to keep this pretty high level. If you have any further questions about anything I present, feel free to reach out to myself or Caroline. You can also purchase the LSI-R SV User's Manual, which will give you much more in-depth information about the normative sample, as well as the reliability and validity studies that we performed in the development of this tool. So the LSI-R SV has a highly representative normative sample of both male and female offenders in custody and on probation. One thing that we found in the development of the LSI-R SV is that its scores strongly correlate with the LSI-R. I often have people ask me, well, if the scores correlate so well with the LSI-R and they measure risk similarly, why do I need both? Well, as we've mentioned throughout this presentation, the SV is a screener. It's only 8 items. It does not provide you with a comprehensive assessment of a variety of factors that may be contributing to the individual's offender. You need the full LSI-R in order to make an effective treatment plan for those medium and high-risk offenders. The screener helps you quickly and effectively identify the risk level and determine who needs the full LSI-R. Let's look at the predictive validity of the LSI-R SV. Is it able to accurately predict recidivism? In our analyses, we found that it was able to accurately predict reconviction, violent reconviction, parole violation, institutional misconduct, institutional assault, and halfway house success. But again, this is what we found as the publishers and the developers of the tool. It's always important that you look to see whether or not independent researchers have been able to replicate these findings. So let's take a look at some of those findings now. Livingston and colleagues in 2015 found the LSI-R SV assessments significantly predicted treatment noncompliance, criminal justice contact, and violent behavior. McCaffrey and Shearer found the LSI-R SV produces accurate assessments of recidivism risk among adult male and female recently released prisoners in the United States. So we can see that this is able to accurately identify offender recidivism in a variety of settings. So in sum, the LSI-R SV is appropriate for all types of offenders. It's appropriate and reliable and valid for all adult populations. The tool is validated on a racially diverse population of both male and females in a variety of institutional settings. So who can use this? Let's look at the qualifications. Users must have completed graduate-level coursework in test measurement or completed certification training on the LSI-R SV. Conversely, If you are already trained in the LSI-R or LSCMI assessments, there is no additional training for the LSI-R SV. You're already equipped to use this tool. How to use it? Well, administration can be done online. Secure online account can be done for managing test administrations. This will give you automatic scoring of the test to reduce error, and will provide you with a computerized report which will provide you with an overall risk score as well as percentile rankings. We also have the LSI-R SV available in paper and pencil format. When do we want to use this tool? Well, there's no need to employ different versions of this tool in a variety of settings. For example, pretrial, sentencing, prison, probation and parole, or for research. The LSI-R SV works in all of these. In fact, we recommend the LSI-R SV be used at all phases of the judicial decision-making process. The LSI-R SV was developed and validated for use at all stages of the justice system. And to the best of our knowledge, no research exists that supports the use of the LSI-R SV at one stage of the justice system over and above that of another stage. Researchers have actually shown that using an organized actuarial risk assessment tool like the LSI-R SV at every stage of the justice system improves efficacy in case planning and decision making because it promotes consistency of language among staff, which can ultimately improve your staff's understanding of the offender's risk. I'm now going to pass it over to Caroline, who's going to tell you about current users of the LSI-R SV and what they're saying about it.
So I think at this point, we have established a good understanding of the benefits for using the LSI-R SV screening tool. But let's take a couple case examples of jurisdictions that have successfully implemented the tool in their practice. And there are many more examples like these from other jurisdictions. So if you'd like to learn more, please feel free to reach out to me, or perhaps we can also discuss implementation options. So we'd like to highlight first Salt Lake County's use of the LSI-R SV. They shared that they use the LSI-R SV for their population, and they claim that it takes 1/3 of the time to conduct. And they're using the LSI-R SV to determine appropriateness for various programming, diversion options, and supervision levels. The tool identifies which offenders need to receive the comprehensive risk needs assessment, in this case, the LSI-R assessment. And the other example is New York City Department of Probation. They implemented the LSI-R SV for all new referrals to the system. And they shared with us that of those that received the screening version, about 16% go on to receive the LSI-R, the full version. So let's recap together now the various benefits of applying a triage approach through the use of a screening tool, and more specifically, the LSI-R SV. We've identified that it allows you to tackle a large caseload with a short 10 to 15 minute administration time. It also allows you to dedicate scarce resources for those who really need it the most. And by adopting the LSI-R SV, considerable cost savings are incurred directly through the better use of officers' time and improved caseloads, and indirectly by helping to reduce staff turnover and overall headcount. We've also learned, with James' assistance, that the LSI-R SV is rooted in evidence-based practice. It is the only measure to contain dynamic items while still maintaining its predictiveness and a normative sample that is representative. By adopting the LSI-R SV, organizations will now have a cost-effective way to pre-screen offenders for their risk of reoffending. It provides a method for triaging those offenders who have a low risk of reoffending into a minimum supervision caseload, and allows officers to prioritize and focus resources on those offenders that are at a high risk to reoffend. And so with that, I would welcome you to reach out to myself or James Lant with any additional questions you may have about the webinar, or perhaps to discuss implementation options of the LSI-R SV in your practice. Our contact information is shown here. And again, we would welcome your comments and questions. We also have a team of consultants in public safety available to discuss your assessment needs. You may contact any one of them here that are within your state. And with that, I hope we've piqued everyone's interest in the LSI-R SV tool. And thank you so much for taking time out of your day to spend it with us. This will conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day.